Hi, in last week's film I did a review of the OM-1 Mk2 camera as far as I could. I was able to say that the autofocus in video mode I feel is quite a bit better. It's much improved, but it was very poor on the Mk1. But I am now using the autofocus for video on the Mk2 far more frequently than I used to. But when it comes to stills mode, at that point I still hadn't been able to prove it. I just haven't had the opportunity to photograph birds in flight over a prolonged period of time, when birds are flying backwards and forwards on a regular basis. I've got plenty of odd shots of birds in flight with it, but I need several hours of birds flying fast in front of me. Well, finally I've had the opportunity. On the 12th of April the weather finally broke in the UK. We've had record levels of rainfall for something like 3 months now. Well, the 12th of April we had 3 dry days. I went down to Kent, to Elmley, where I often go in the spring to photograph the Lapwings doing their aerial display. And that's a very challenging subject for autofocus. They are very fast when they gambol about in the sky and dive down towards the ground. Well, the conditions on the afternoon of the 12th were perfect. The wind was in the right direction, the light was in the right direction, and I managed to take thousands of pictures of flying lapwings over about a 3-hour period. So now I'm going to be able to tell you if I think the autofocus is better on the Mk2 or not. If you start looking on websites, you'll find quite a variety of opinion. You'll get people saying it's substantially improved, and you'll get people who say it's a little bit better. And only one website have I come across where it's saying that the Mk1 autofocus is better than the Mk2. None of this is unusual. Whenever you get a new camera or a new firmware update, there's always a polarized view. There's always people who think it's better and always people that think it's worse. And people like me are often sitting in the middle, can't make up their minds. But anyway, this is what I think.
Now, I have taken plenty of flight pictures with the Mk2 since I've had it. This goldeneye, for instance, but it was very much a grab shot. I didn't see the bird coming, so I wasn't able to get it in the viewfinder, get it into focus and then start taking pictures. I just got it in the viewfinder and hit the button and started taking pictures immediately. The first few frames were therefore out of focus, but the autofocus clicked in, it got it sharp, and it held it sharp at 50 frames per second coming towards me until the bird was far too big in the frame. It did an excellent job. But the Mk1 would have also done this equally well, unless I get a bird flying backwards and forwards on a regular basis so I can start to see what the percentage of success is. It doesn't really tell me that much. I had a few more opportunities with this rook. It flew past me maybe 3 times, but that was over a period of about an hour, so quite long waits in between. Still not what I'm really looking for. And a mallard in quite a dramatic flight pose. Now, this cormorant collecting nest material, I did have maybe 10 opportunities to photograph it as it kept coming in and picking up new material, but the lighting was very dull. It was just after sunrise, but I'm in a wooded little channel, so there was no light penetrating, and when you've got a dark bird against a dark background, the autofocus is always going to struggle, and it did. It got some sharp, but the failure rate was quite high. These sparrows were taken using Pro Capture, and it was the first time that I had a feeling that the Mk2 was doing a better job. The birds are going up and towards me slightly. If they were going sideways, the Mk1 would have coped very well. But because they're coming forwards, that's quite a challenge for a small bird like this. And I started to think, yeah, the success rate here is being higher than I would expect with the Mk1. Now, bird detection autofocus does work better against a distant plain background rather than a messy background, but it did okay with this hooded crow, but again, so would the Mk1. Nothing that special. So here we are at Elmley on the 12th of April, and I say I had a prolonged period of lots of pictures of lapwings swooping down out of the sky and then turning as they come down to the ground and flying towards me and into the wind. And the success rate was higher than I would anticipate getting with the Mk1. I wasn't trying to use the 2 cameras side by side, but I've been using the Mk1 long enough to have a feeling as to how successful it would be. A problem that I always had with the Mark 1 is if I did a burst of say 50 pictures of a bird in flight, it nearly always would lose the focus somewhere in that 50 pictures for 1, 2 or occasionally 3 frames and then come back into focus again. It seemed to pulse and just go out of focus. That wasn't happening with the Mark II. However, I'm not saying it never lost focus. It did sometimes lose focus for several frames, but it wasn't regular. It was happening just occasionally. Before this hair started to run, I had swapped over to the dog or cat symbol or mammal symbol, whatever you want to call it. But it did lock onto the hair very well as it was running through this long grass. It was almost as if this hare was hunting like a leopard. It was going for this pheasant. What I imagine happened is this would be a female hare and she's probably got a leveret hidden away in that long grass somewhere and the pheasant was getting too close. That would be my guess. So based on these 3 days I had down in Kent, I have been able to convince myself that the autofocus on the Mark II is a little bit better. But it's not a huge amount, it's tiny. And if I was to try and break it down, and this is very difficult to do, but I've just got a gut feeling about it, that it's not so much that it's better at acquiring focus in the first place. So when you have a grab shot opportunity, such as the GoldenEye that I started with, the success rate is about the same as the Mark I, as to whether it locks onto that GoldenEye or not. But once it's locked on, it tends to stay locked on better than the Mark I. Very hard to prove that, but it's the way I'm feeling about it.
Probably worth pointing out that none of those pictures are cropped. That's how they were taken. Generally speaking, I don't crop pictures. If the bird's not big enough in the frame, I don't take it. It is easier to keep a bird in focus if you're doing it small in the frame. But the lapwing is a very challenging species. It's fast and erratic. So that was a very good test for the autofocus. But there's other aspects to autofocus. We've already talked about the initial acquisition of focus and then how sticky the focus is after that, but also you've got things such as what about a messy background? That's a bit easier to test. And also, what if the bird is hidden behind branches? How much difference is there then between the Mark I and Mark II? Well, the reason it's easier to test is we can do it with a static subject. We can do it with a model bird. So I have 2 model birds with me, which I can put inside the tree so the bird is slightly obscured by the branches going across it, and I can test it out with both the Mark I and the Mark II. Both cameras have got the latest firmware update on them. I think with the Mark I it's 1.6 and with the Mark II it's 1.1.
I'm starting off with the Mark II camera. I've got bird detection on, continuous autofocus and all focusing points active. And I did each of these tests about 20 times. You've got to keep repeating it to see if you're getting the same result each time. I simply moved the camera onto the bird and yes, it focused on the head straight away. And then you take the focus away from the bird, zoom in a little bit and try it again. And does it jump straight onto the bird? Yes, it did. And then I would try exactly the same thing, but with the Mark I. Take it out of focus first and move across. You can see you get different boxes with the Mark I, so you know which camera you're using, but the autofocus was just as good at jumping onto the bird's head. So again, I couldn't see any difference between the 2 cameras. I then tried it on a robin with just a messy background and again used both cameras. So this is the Mark II. You can tell from the box it doesn't draw a box around the bird's body. So now this is the Mark I, and I was getting very similar results. There was no obvious difference. It was jumping onto the bird very accurately, whichever camera I used.
The only other situation I can think of is what happens when a bird flies behind an object, behind a tree for instance. That is something I can't recreate. I can't arrange for a bird to go flying behind things. and it's just going to happen by accident at some point. But with the Mark 1, I always thought it was remarkably good at that, and I have got YouTube examples of it. I've got pictures where a wood pigeon flew behind a gravestone and it emerged on the other side of the gravestone still in focus. And also, more recent film, I showed a buzzard going behind a tree and coming out in focus. So the Mark 1, I think, has been very good at it, and I would expect the Mark 2 to be at least as good. There's so many variables there. Depends on the size of the object, depends on how you've got the sensitivity set up, sensitivity setting in the autofocus settings. So there's lots of variables, but it's something I can't recreate. It's taken me quite a few weeks to get to a point where I have an opinion on whether the Mark II is better than the Mark 1, and yes, it is. I do feel the autofocus is a little bit more sticky. It doesn't seem to acquire focus any better, and I can't see any other differences, but it does seem to hold on to the subject better when you're doing birds in flight. But it's very marginal. There's not a great deal in it, but there's enough for me that whenever I'm doing birds in flight from now on, I'm only going to be using the Mark II. Thanks for watching.